In the dense rainforests of Phuoc Tuy Province during 1968, the jungle possessed an unusual quality that unnerved even the most experienced soldiers. Sound did not echo through the canopy. Instead, it was absorbed by the triple-layered vegetation, the moisture-heavy air, and the sheer density of the foliage. This acoustic void created an atmosphere of constant tension, where the absence of noise became more threatening than any sound could be. This environmental characteristic would play a crucial role in one of the most remarkable instances of inter-allied cooperation during the Vietnam War, when Australian Special Air Service soldiers, operating in their signature silent manner, would intervene to save an American Navy SEAL reconnaissance team from certain destruction. The American predicament. Shadow 6 in crisis. The Navy SEAL reconnaissance team, operating under the call sign Shadow 6, had been conducting operations deep within territory controlled by the North Vietnamese Army for 48 hours, when their mission parameters fundamentally changed. What had been planned as a straightforward hit-and-fade operation transformed into a desperate struggle for survival. By mid-1968, SEAL teams were deploying in 12-man platoons, though often breaking into smaller squads for specific missions, conducting ambushes, reconnaissance patrols, and intelligence operations throughout the Vietnamese theater. Shadow 6 represented this new operational structure, composed of highly trained specialists conducting surveillance along a critical supply corridor. Their mission objectives were clear. Insert quietly into the operational zone, observe and document enemy troop movements along supply routes feeding into the region, and extract before detection. The team's composition reflected the elite nature of SEAL operations during this period, with each member bringing specialized skills honed through previous combat deployments. The mission's critical failure point came through an unforeseen circumstance. A Claymore anti-personnel mine, likely abandoned by retreating Viet Cong forces during an earlier engagement, had been positioned along their movement path. The tripwire mechanism activated when the team's rear scout contacted it, triggering an explosion that, while not fatal, reverberated through the jungle with devastating tactical consequences. Within minutes of the detonation, the operational environment transformed completely. Radio intercepts suggested that North Vietnamese forces had successfully triangulated the explosion's origin point. By 1500 hours, the American team found themselves in an increasingly desperate tactical situation. Small arms fire originating from 3 distinct directions indicated they were being systematically boxed into a killing zone with no viable extract route. The situation deteriorated further as meteorological conditions shifted. The monsoon season, arriving earlier than anticipated, brought visibility to near zero levels. The monsoon in Phuoc Tuy Province typically lasted from mid-May through October, producing several hours of intense rainfall twice daily. This weather made close air support impossible and helicopter extraction unfeasible. The triple canopy jungle environment, already restricting aerial observation, became completely impenetrable from above. The SEAL team's circumstances became increasingly dire. 5 operators, 1 suffering from shrapnel wounds, 2 with limited ammunition reserves remaining, faced an enemy force that had transitioned from reconnaissance to assault preparation. The composition of Shadow 6. Lieutenant Dan Kessler commanded Shadow 6, bringing extensive operational experience to the mission. His service record included over a dozen direct action raids throughout the Mekong Delta region, where SEAL teams had been operating intensively. SEALs found themselves positioned in the Rung Sat Special Zone and the Mekong Delta, fulfilling riverine operations throughout the war. Kessler's fluency in Vietnamese and his exceptional ability to read terrain made him invaluable for deep reconnaissance operations. His subordinates referred to him with a nickname that spoke to his demeanor under fire. His composure during combat situations became legendary within the team. Petty Officer First Class Miguel Cruz served as second in command, bringing urban survival skills learned in Brooklyn to jungle warfare applications. His expertise in close-quarters combat made him the team's designated specialist for situations requiring silence and precision. Cruz carried an M3 submachine gun and demonstrated particular proficiency with suppressed weapons when operations required minimal acoustic signature. Hospital Corpsman Riley possessed the critical medical skills that kept SEAL teams operational in environments far from conventional medical support. His improvisational abilities with limited medical supplies had previously saved team members' lives under extreme circumstances. In the jungle environment, where conventional medical evacuation could take hours or prove impossible, Riley's presence represented the difference between survivable injuries and fatal outcomes. The remaining operators, Specialists Carlson and Henley, while younger, embodied the selection standards that made SEAL teams so effective. These men operated on a principle of immediate response to tactical situations without requiring extensive verbal communication or deliberation. The nature of SEAL operations in 1968. From 1965 through 1972, combined SEAL team strength grew to nearly 400 active operators, though seldom more than 120 deployed to Vietnam simultaneously. The team's operational methodology emphasized surgical precision, rapid insertion, precisely executed objectives, and immediate extract into riverways or dense vegetation. Their tactical repertoire included ambush operations, extraction missions, and sabotage. These represented their operational rhythm and comfort zone. Extended static defensive positions for 18 hours without support, illumination, or reinforcement capability fell outside their typical mission profiles. The engagement Shadow 6 found themselves in violated every principle of SEAL operational doctrine. The jungle environment itself presented constant challenges beyond enemy action. The triple canopy structure prevented sunlight penetration and obscured celestial navigation references. Moisture permeated every surface, causing weapon corrosion, optical equipment fogging, and continuous boot submersion that led to severe skin deterioration. The atmospheric density created a sensation of physical pressure. Radio signal propagation through the dense foliage proved extremely difficult, and the only sounds louder than sporadic fire were the constant insect chorus. However, Shadow 6's personnel had confronted challenging situations previously. They had operated alongside Montagnard tribal forces, called in artillery strikes within 50 meters of their own positions, and evaded Viet Cong tracking teams supported by dogs and North Vietnamese snipers concealed in elevated positions. This particular engagement, however, possessed a qualitatively different character that became evident as the situation developed. At 02:10 hours, Cruz verbalized the tactical assessment that everyone recognized. The enemy forces were not conducting rushed assaults or probing attacks. They were demonstrating patience, suggesting confidence in their position. Kessler understood the implications immediately. Confident enemies typically possessed superior intelligence or positioning. The perimeter claymore mines remained undisturbed throughout the night, which provided crucial tactical intelligence. The North Vietnamese forces were not desperate for immediate engagement. They were conducting a deliberate encirclement operation. Riley continued treating Carlson's shrapnel wound, which showed concerning signs of progressive swelling, despite not yet showing infection. Time was working against the team in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The team's morale, while not characterized by panic, had transitioned from hopeful to grimly realistic. Then a distinctive suppressed rifle report echoed through the jungle darkness. The weapon's acoustic signature did not match either M16 or AK pattern rifles. Something anomalous had entered the tactical environment. The suppressed shot was followed by an audible impact, a body falling, distinguishable from vegetation or debris. Cruz's observation to Kessler captured the moment's significance. The fallen individual was not from their team. Kessler's assessment acknowledged an uncomfortable reality. An unknown element had just eliminated a North Vietnamese soldier while deliberately maintaining concealment. The Australian intervention,
ghosts operating in plain sight. Approximately 2 kilometers west of Shadow 6's deteriorating position, a 5-man Australian SAS patrol had been conducting their own operation with characteristic silence. This patrol had inserted 3 nights previously, using a stealth landing zone known only to their unit and one Royal Australian Air Force pilot who had trained with them during previous operations in Borneo. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian and New Zealand SAS forces in Vietnam conducted nearly 1,200 patrols and inflicted 492 confirmed enemy casualties, with 106 additional probable kills, operating from Nui Dat as the reconnaissance eyes and ears of the 1st Australian Task Force. Their mission parameters appeared straightforward in documentation, but proved extraordinarily demanding in execution. Locate suspected North Vietnamese logistics trails feeding into supply corridors, map enemy movement patterns, and disappear without trace. Sergeant Mick Rowden led the patrol, carrying experience from operations in Borneo that had refined his approach to jungle warfare to an almost supernatural level. His methodology treated every leaf and branch as a potential security compromise. His leadership style relied on minimal verbal communication, instead using hand signals, deliberate pauses, and movement that resembled mist dispersing through vegetation. Corporal Payne served as lead scout, possessing tracking abilities that transcended conventional military skills. His capacity to extract information from footprints extended to determining whether the person who left them was fatigued, injured, or carrying additional weight beyond normal equipment loads. Fellow soldiers claimed he had successfully tracked Viet Cong forces through typhoon conditions without losing the trail. The hyperbolic assessment that he could follow shadows contained a kernel of truth about his exceptional abilities. Signalman Terry Henderson maintained communications, operating under strict protocols. His equipment had been modified with field-expedient filters calibrated to avoid enemy direction-finding systems. Operating under radio silence for 36 hours according to standard procedure, Henderson had been monitoring frequencies rather than transmitting. What Henderson intercepted just before dawn didn't originate from jungle sounds or natural phenomena. Encrypted burst transmissions, faint but detectable, carried clear American characteristics. Someone was transmitting on an emergency frequency using short-range equipment with a transmission rhythm suggesting extreme stress. While no location coordinates were provided, the transmission's characteristics indicated severe tactical difficulty. Rowden signaled an immediate halt. The patrol integrated into surrounding foliage until they became effectively invisible. Australian SAS doctrine didn't emphasize rapid response to rescue situations. Their methodology focused on environmental observation until the terrain itself revealed critical information. Payne identified the trail first, faint boot impressions moving eastward before doubling back in patterns suggesting disorientation rather than tactical maneuvering. The footwear wasn't North Vietnamese Army issue or civilian footwear. These were American combat boots characteristic of a small reconnaissance element. Additional evidence emerged, North Vietnamese Army tracks shadowing the American movement, with multiple personnel maintaining heavy spacing in patterns characteristic of encirclement operations. The Americans weren't simply being followed, they were being herded toward a predetermined kill zone. Rowden examined his map. If the American element continued their eastern movement, they would enter a narrow gully surrounded by elevated vegetation, providing ideal ambush positioning. The tactical setup represented textbook North Vietnamese ambush doctrine, and the Americans were already approximately halfway into the trap. The Australian patrol responded without verbal discussion. A series of hand signals communicated tactical decisions more efficiently than spoken orders. The patrol shifted to the northeast, positioning themselves to observe the ambush preparations rather than engaging immediately or attempting direct contact with the American forces.
By 04:30 a.m., they occupied elevated positions allowing observation of North Vietnamese soldiers preparing their ambush positions.
The Australians maintained absolute silence and stillness. They waited for the precise moment when the jungle environment would provide optimal opportunity for intervention. When Rowden raised his rifle and fired a single suppressed shot, the tactical dynamic fundamentally changed. The enemy's perspective, confusion and casualties. The North Vietnamese platoon commander, occupying a concealed position beneath jungle vines, had been monitoring the tactical situation with growing confidence. His force of 30 fighters formed a wide crescent formation aimed directly at the gully where American reconnaissance forces had been contained. The maneuvering had proceeded flawlessly, with careful tracking of boot prints and spent cartridge cases, while maintaining sufficient distance to avoid alerting their quarry. Contact was anticipated within the hour when the first anomaly appeared. One flank scout failed to report at his scheduled interval. The absence of communication, rather than being dramatic, simply represented a break in established routine. Then a second soldier disappeared. No gunfire reports, no distress calls, just 2 personnel vanished as though the jungle itself had consumed them. The commander ordered a sweep operation. 5 soldiers moved toward the western edge of their formation to investigate. Only 3 returned, visibly shaken, 1 bleeding from a shoulder laceration. The wounded soldier attempted to describe encounters with foreign soldiers, but couldn't articulate coherent observations. His rifle was missing, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The commander began recognizing a disturbing reality. His hunting force was no longer the only predatory element operating in the forest. Meanwhile, Sergeant Rowden directed operations from an elevated ridge concealed by bamboo and atmospheric moisture. Silent hand signals orchestrated patrol movements. Payne disappeared into vegetation before the foliage finished moving from his passage. The North Vietnamese crescent formation was beginning to collapse inward, but a carefully created gap now existed in their perimeter, a blind spot precisely sized to allow infiltration by forces specializing in invisibility. The Australians' tactical approach did not involve direct American rescue operations at this stage. Such action would compromise their positioning and eliminate their primary advantage. Their methodology involved more precise intervention, systematically removing components from the North Vietnamese formation with surgical precision. Suppressed shots eliminated specific targets. Tripwires were adjusted so enemy soldiers would trigger their own explosive devices. Claymore mines were repositioned to different aiming points. Movement sounds were simulated on opposite flanks to draw attention away from actual patrol positions. This represented jungle sabotage and psychological warfare conducted at 2-meter distances. By 06:30 a.m., the North Vietnamese commander was beginning to sense the presence of an unseen threat hunting his own forces. Soldiers whispered nervously amongst themselves. They had anticipated hunting Americans, but now something that operated without sound, left no footprints, and didn't follow conventional warfare rules was stalking them. One soldier followed a blood trail into dense vegetation and never emerged. The commander ordered a tactical halt. His perimeter began tightening around the gully more rapidly now, with movements suggesting desperation. If they could eliminate the SEAL team before this invisible threat completely unraveled their formation, the mission might still succeed. High in the tree line, Rowden checked his watch and gave a slight nod. The predetermined moment had arrived. The turning point. Coordinated chaos. The North Vietnamese left flank exploded in cascading detonations of green fire and shrapnel. 6 claymore mines rigged in a tight arc, manually detonated from a ridge position just 20 meters distant, cut through the jungle like a blade through canvas. The blast was followed by screaming, then silence resumed. Rowden produced one sharp whistle through his teeth, barely audible, but sufficient for coordination. Payne fired 2 suppressed rounds in rapid succession, both striking North Vietnamese radio operators attempting to re-establish communications on the southern perimeter edge. Henderson transmitted a single word over communications equipment: Phoenix. Contained in a sunken ground patch choked with bamboo and thornbush, the 6 Navy SEAL operators had been exchanging sporadic fire with North Vietnamese forward scouts throughout the night. Ammunition supplies had declined critically. No medical evacuation capability existed. No artillery support was available. Just hope that someone had received their earlier emergency transmission. When the Claymore detonations began, Lieutenant Ramirez instantly recognized the tactical signature. The execution didn't match American doctrine or standard operating procedures. This represented ghost work characteristic of Australian operations. He didn't waste time analyzing the situation. The opportunity was immediately clear. Enemy flanks were under assault, providing a window for movement. The SEAL team broke from concealment with calculated violence. 2 fragmentation grenades were deployed forward, followed by bounding overwatch movement through the gully with suppressive fire maintained in tight, controlled bursts. This wasn't a retreat operation. They were executing a tactical pivot. The North Vietnamese forces, caught between 2 jaws of a trap they hadn't known existed, lost formation cohesion. Some fired wildly into trees, others dropped to ground positions uncertain about threat directions. Their commander attempted to regroup through shouted orders, but his voice was lost in chaos. His training had never addressed this scenario, an enemy that couldn't be observed, struck without warning, and vanished without leaving evidence. On the ridge, Rowden's patrol advanced with glacial precision. They weren't joining the SEAL element directly yet. Their mission involved shaping the battlefield environment rather than direct engagement. Payne eliminated another enemy soldier through his M16 scope with a single shot to center mass. Henderson tracked North Vietnamese radio chatter, noting which frequencies went silent. The SEAL team punched through the collapsing edge of the North Vietnamese ambush perimeter. One operator took a round to the shoulder. Doc Lacey dragged him into cover under field dressing, without verbal communication. Then came the decisive moment.
2 North Vietnamese squads attempted to regroup near a fallen log trench where the Australians had prepared another surprise. A line of daisy-chained Claymore mines triggered simultaneously, followed by 5 seconds of precision SAS rifle fire. When the engagement ended, no return fire followed, just cordite smell and jungle silence resuming. The North Vietnamese survivors scattered. For the first time since dawn, the enemy wasn't hunting, they were fleeing. The extraction, opening and closing windows. By 0730 hours, the North Vietnamese formation no longer constituted an organized military force. It had fragmented into scattered personnel, some evacuating wounded, others moving in chaotic directions. Their commander had been observed crawling into a ravine following the second Claymore detonation. Whether he survived became tactically irrelevant. The trap was already closing from a different direction. SEAL Lieutenant Ramirez understood that the tactical window was open, but would not remain so indefinitely. The jungle operated according to rhythms, and North Vietnamese reinforcements could arrive within the hour if any transmissions successfully reached higher command. He keyed his handset, operating on minimal battery power, and transmitted the extraction signal using non-standard code that the Australians would interpret correctly. Sergeant Rowden responded with a single nod. Henderson adjusted his directional antenna and clicked his microphone in acknowledgement. While the SEAL team moved out with their injured operator supported between 2 teammates, the SAS patrol shifted laterally. Their mission had evolved from disruption operations to extraction support. Payne and another patrol member established a new ambush position 200 meters behind the SEAL team's projected path. The setup involved no elaborate preparations, just mines positioned in optimal locations, rifles sighted on likely pursuit lines, and silence so profound it could arrest heartbeats. The jungle began folding inward again. Vines hung motionless. Birds returned to normal activity patterns, but the SAS didn't reappear. They moved as though they were integral components of the undergrowth itself. The SEAL team was hurting, Low ammunition, one operator bleeding, another limping from a fall during movement, but they moved rapidly. Ramirez trusted that whoever was providing overwatch in the jungle had their backs, even though he had never observed them directly. One of his men muttered about phantoms and bloody jungle ghosts. The assessment wasn't far from accuracy. At 0802 hours, the 1st North Vietnamese Rear Guard Unit attempted pursuit. A squad of 8 soldiers, still shaken but determined, followed broken trail markers through underbrush. They never identified what struck them. 6 explosions in sequence echoed like distant thunder. A final shot rang out, sharp and precise. Payne had finished the last soldier cleanly. By the time the SEAL team reached the landing zone, a clearing barely sufficient for a Huey helicopter, sunlight was punching shafts through the canopy. The characteristic sound of rotor blades signaled salvation. Dust kicked up as Ramirez waved smoke grenade identification. Behind him, 3 operators held defensive positions while wounded personnel were lifted aboard. As the last SEAL climbed aboard, he turned to look back toward the tree line. He saw nothing, just leaves, shadow, and silence. Deep in that jungle, the SAS watched, unmoving and invisible. Mission complete. They didn't board the helicopter. They melted back into the green, because their assignment wasn't rescue operations, it was the hunt. The aftermath, ripples through special operations. When the Huey touched down at the forward operations base, the Navy SEAL operators looked as though they had physically torn themselves from a nightmare. Covered in mud and blood, operating on adrenaline and silence, medics rushed to provide immediate care. The wounded were prioritized for treatment first, but as stretchers passed through the triage tent, Lieutenant Ramirez wasn't focused on blood loss statistics. He was contemplating the ghosts who had saved them. The after-action debrief commenced that evening in a corrugated iron briefing room illuminated by a single hanging bulb. An American intelligence officer, clipboard in hand, asked the opening question about how they managed to break contact. Ramirez leaned forward with a direct response. They hadn't broken contact. The Australians had done it for them. Shortly thereafter, a liaison from the Australian SAS squadron arrived. Captain Jim Warren appeared more suited to cattle ranching than commando operations. Dusty boots, calm eyes, no visible rank insignia. He didn't introduce himself with formal titles, simply stating he was glad the American operators made it out safely and suggesting they discuss observations. The SEAL team naturally had questions. Who had positioned the Claymore mines? How long had the Australian patrol been tracking the North Vietnamese unit? How had they moved so close without detection? Warren answered some inquiries while allowing others to hang without response. He explained they had been operating north of the Americans' last known position, intercepted their contact report, and decided to shadow the engagement while laying tactical surprises. Ramirez nodded slowly before acknowledging that the Australian intervention had saved American lives. Warren didn't smile when responding that the action wasn't charity. That particular North Vietnamese unit had been on Australian operational lists as well. The Americans had simply been in the enemy's path. Nevertheless, mutual respect now existed between the two teams, an unspoken bond forged not through doctrine, but through shared experience in the jungle crucible of Vietnam. Doc Lacey articulated it effectively. He had never observed soldiers move like that, as though the jungle itself granted them passage. The Australians operated differently from American SEAL teams. They didn't rely on firepower overwhelming enemies or rapid movement. They relied on absence, on remaining unseen, unheard, and untraceable. Their warfare was conducted through whispers and footprints rather than explosions and skirmish lines.